Gilgulim. The first is brother selling Yosef, and this is the foundation of the Asar Arugi Malchus, Asar Arugi Melucha. Like the guy wanted to kill the Aseres, the Tzadikim, and they asked no Milo if the Eibush judge them take this way, and the Eibush said that they should makabel it. And it says in Sfarim that the 10 Tzadikim, 10 Tanoim who were killed in that Kufa of Reimi were the Gilgulim of the Aseres HaShvatim, the 10 Shvatim. One of the boys did me a favor, gave me a ride. So we were discussing who was the 10th. Benjamin wasn't there, and Reuben wasn't there, and Yosef was the one being sold. So there's different days who the 10th was. One day is that it goes to the Eibishter. And
what?
The Eibishter was the 10th. He was the 10th to the minion that they kept a secret. But I saw a different day that it was Yosef himself. Because Yosef led them on. Yosef created the possibility for them to have suspicions of him, which would bring to them selling him. So the 10 tzaddikim, the 10 tanoim who were murdered were instead of the Aseres HaShvatim. The second example of Gilgul, this week's Pasha, is that we have the first case in the Torah of Yibum. Dies, and Yehuda asks Tamar to marry Oinan. Then Oinan dies, and in the end, Yehuda himself marries Tamar. I want to approach Gilgulim from the perspective of Torah, the Higoyin, the Indian of Gilgul, the concept of Gilgul Nishamas. And you should know that in the Rishonim, the place where Gilgulim comes up is the Parshas VAYEISHEV. The Rabbeinu Bechaya, especially, the Ramban also, allude to Gilgulim in these two cases, in our Pasha that I just mentioned. The idea that the 10 Arugi Melucha were the Nishamas of the Aseres HaShvatim, and the idea that Yibu, that a man dies and leaves no children, somebody, his relative, his brother or his father should marry his widowed wife, and Akim Hashem Achav HaMeis, it's explained that Kabbalah, it has to do with Gilgul, because there's a connection between brothers, and there's obviously a connection between a man's neshama and a woman's neshama, and by the virtue of somebody who is from the family marrying the deceased, they give a kiyum to his neshama in the offspring that will come from their union. It's a concept of Gilgul. So let me do this. Let me first tell you what you have in your package over here. Okay, you have shtikalach. I made arrows wherever I was able. The first two pages are Ramban. Yeah, a Ramban in Parshas Bereishis. The second Ramban is an Ramban in our Pasha, and I will tell you this very straight. The Ramban tells you much of nothing. This is a classic example of the Ramban telling you Kabbalah, Megala Tefach, Machase Asad Tefachim. He doesn't say a word. Look at it inside. Then you have 3 pages of Rabbeinu Bechaya. You have Rabbeinu Bechaya from our Pasha. You have Rabbeinu Bechaya from Parshas Vayigash. And you have Rabbeinu Bechaya from Parshas Shmeis. And notice that in Parshas Shmeis I found that Rabbeinu Bechaya without notes, so you can actually read the words. Then you have a Rekanti. The Rekanti on this Pasha is voluminous. I thought to myself, I've never learned Rekanti. I'm learning it for the first time. And what I think is the case is that Rekanti was a bit mukubal. He was the first generation after the rediscovery of Isaiah, and he's a malaket. You read these 10 pages of Rekanti, he doesn't always tell you, but it's Shtiker Ramban, it's Shtiker Rabbeinu Bechaya, it's Shtiker Zeh, Shtiker Gemara. He brings over here the whole figure of Gilgul. Somebody wants to read Gilgul in addition. Here you have it in a comprehensive way. Now, let me just on Gilgulim. The last page is the controversial page. It's the Rapsadi God, the Rasag. And the Rasag condemned the idea of Gilgul as a Goyish concept with terrible severity. And this is really my excuse. The Tzadi God is very, very critical of the concept of Gilgul. So this is what you have here. A lot of pages that talk about the name of Gilgulim. Let's talk about Gilgul for a moment as a Hagdama, and then we'll look a little bit. And the emphasis, I think that we can at least talk a little bit about the idea of Gilgulim. And what I would like to do is explain to you that what the Tzadi Gaon is saying, even though he's so forcefully objecting to the idea of Gilgulim, his objection to Gilgulim was based on his concept of Gilgulim. In other words, he didn't have the Kabbalistic concept of Gilgulim. If he had the Kabbalistic concept of Gilgulim, he would have agreed with it. The concept of Gilgulim that he had is very, very like the Hindu concept, like the Eastern concept. And I can assure you that Arizal agrees with him that there's no such concept as Gilgulim. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. The beginning of the sugya of Gilgul, in other words, to understand the concept of Gilgul, you have to understand the concept of the relatedness of the Neshamas, which is elementary Hasidus. It's Hasidus 101. The idea that Neshamas are connected, that there's a link between Neshamas. In Tanya, you have two sugyas of Neshamas. And they say, in a way, opposite points. Tanya Perek Lev, Perek Lamed Beis, talks about the relatedness of Neshamas. Its focus is on the sameness of Neshamas. How Neshamas are all one. No. Mi yedei gelossen umalossen b'shoshen u'mkerem u'mkim chayim. B'shagam shekulu masim is avach l'kulana. This is three madregas. But the Nakuda is the purpose of Perek Lamed Beis is you should love your fellow as yourself because he's a piece of you. And the message of Perek Lamed Beis is how all Neshamas are one, as opposed to the distinction between Neshamas. The other place where you have a discussion about Neshamas is in Tanya Perek Beis, chapter 2. But over there, the emphasis is exactly the opposite. Because over there, he's talking about the relationship between Neshamas, but the concept is that some Neshamas are bigger than others. As opposed to Perek Lamed Beis, he wants to really bring out Kulan Masimis and Avach Kulana, the sameness of Neshamas. In Tanya Perek Beis, the intent is to bring out the differences between Neshamas. And he illustrates it by explaining the physical development of a fetus from a tipa, from one single point. It develops into Ramach Evarim Shashar Gidim, 248 limbs and so on. It begins with a tipa, with a single point, which is from the Atmos of Mayach, which comes from the essence of the father's mind, and it develops in the Rechem, in the womb of the female, and it diversifies. One becomes many, until you have not just a lot of different details, but a lot of different levels. You have a brain and a heart, and you have hair and nails. Dvarim achi pnimiyim and dvarim achi chetzainim. And Dr. Rabbi says, Im kol zeh, aydena kshuda umyuchedes b'musa b'tzmus narishin shehu atmos me'achav. Even after the hair and the nails develop from the tipas me'achav, they continue to be connected to the me'achav. So in Tanya chapter 2, the focus, the intent, the Alter Rebbe's point is, all the Neshamas are connected, but they're not the same. They're very different. Some are the head, and some are the arms, and some are the heart, and some are the eyes, and some are the legs, and some are the nails and the hair. The most chitanias, they get those peripheral ideas. So the yesod of Gilgul Neshamas really is Ichud Neshamas. The belief that all Neshamas come from a common source, and that they radiate outward, and downward is the basis for it, right? Technical Kabbalah, you would say this. All the Bereshim was one Neshama. He encompasses the Neshamas of all Yidden that would ever exist. All the Bereshim's Neshama developed into many, many different aspects. Some Neshamas come from one aspect of Adam Bereshim, some Neshamas come from a different aspect of Adam Bereshim. Or said slightly differently, Adam Bereshim is one Neshama that encompasses the whole Klal Yisrael. And then there were the seven shepherds, right? The Sfiris, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yankov, whatever they are, that are the source of a large group of neshamas, right? And the way it works, that a neshama on a higher level is a yesod, and on a lower level, one becomes many, right? You understand what I'm saying? The higher you go, the more inclusive the neshamas are. The lower you go, the more diversified, the more split, the more spread out it is. So the concept of Gilgul Neshamas is rooted really in the concept of Ichud Neshamas. When you understand the idea that all Neshamas are the same in their root, in other words, they're all connected in a very, very complex web, you understand the connection between Neshamas. Another very important thing to understand about Gilgul, and the emphasis that's common sense is, Gilgul doesn't mean that the same Neshama comes back a second time. The Lashenis that I use is that it's an onaf, it's a branch from the original Neshama. In other words, Eid and Oinan. Oinan was supposed to be Yabim Tamar because Eid was killed or died. Oinan is like the same Neshama as Eid. Oinan is related to Eid. And the purpose is that there would be a child born from the union between Einan and Tamar, which would be the neshama of Eir, but it wouldn't be the neshama of Eir. It would be a branch from the neshama of Eir. The idea, in other words, Gilgul is complicated. Gilgul is not simply, the Eibishter has a big freezer full of batteries. He takes a battery and he puts it into a person, and takes the battery back, puts it back in the neshama. Oh, let's use that battery again. It's much, much more complicated than that. The issue is that neshamas on a higher level are more unified. The neshamas on a lower level are more dispersed, are more scattered, are more splintered. In other words, why are there fewer tzaddikim than regular people? Because tzaddikim are bigger neshamas. What is a bigger neshama? In the neshama of a tzaddik, there's a possibility for a lot of smaller neshamas. And it's conceivable that in a different generation, that neshama of a tzaddik will come back into this world, but not in precisely the same way it was in the first Gilgul on the lower level. So if the Gilgul of that tzaddik will be on the lower level and will therefore be many, as opposed to one. In other words, Gilgul neshamas is not simply the pashtus coming back a second time. It's an onof, it's a branch from the original neshama.
So to say that a tzaddik in one day is verbunden with really neshamas from a weiter day. Was is eigenlijk a tzaddik and neshama close in the day to the people that are living in that day?
Oh, because they're nitzutis from his neshama. He's a neshama close. In other words, Gilgulim was only one concept. It's not the only concept. It's not like the whole explanation of the Ishtalshus of neshamas is Gilgulim. Gilgulim is one of them. But the concept that Alter Rebbe talks about in time is a much more basic concept than Gilgulim. That the neshamas are groups, clusters, right? The Zohar uses a lashon. When you get to mitzvahs, the Ramach Ivarim, he says, "Ka'anvin d'talya be'itkela," like grapes hanging on a cluster. The neshamas are in clusters, bunches. The neshama klolos encompasses the whole bunch of the neshamas that come down in his generation. It's possible that tzaddik is also a Gilgul. But being also a Gilgul doesn't mean he's only a Gilgul. You understand what I'm saying? Gilgulim is one aspect. Your individual neshamas in that generation are also Gilgulim. But there's a hishtalshelus. In other words, hishtalshelus means to say, even if there are neshamas in this generation, some are Gilgulim from 100 years ago, some are Gilgulim from 1,000 years ago, but if they come down in this generation, they have to come through the neshama clause of this generation. They're not a contradiction. B'chlal, a neshama clause is a different category. The real thing that I want to get to is in Tzaddik. He disagrees with Gilgulim. I'm going to business to verstehen. What is the noch a Gedanke? We hear all the time that the Eibishter's Ratzon, the Eibishter's Kavanah could have been fulfilled in a lot of different ways. For example, if Adam Rishon not eaten Mitzvahs Tevara, it says in the books, Shabbos would have come, the world would have been mutter, Mashiach would have come and destroy. What would happen to us? Yankov Avinu, last week's Pasha, sends a message to Esav, I'm ready. Ich will get to Mashiach. And he finds out that Esav is not ready. And he postpones it. What would have happened if Yankov and Esav had Yemot negotiated? So it doesn't the Chumash what would have happened. And by the way, the same is true historically. There have been a number of moments where we say Mashiach could have come. What's Yankov's answer to Esav? The children are young, but the animals are weak, soft. They're going to go too quickly to say it, they're going to be tired out, they're going to die. So it's explained, the Rebbe spoke once in a sikha, a very emotional sikha, where Yankov Avinu was ready for Mashiach. Esav was ready for Mashiach. But had Mashiach come at that time, the Yeladim, the children, and the tzayid in the bucket, the sheep and the cattle, which are the lower neshamas, would have been destroyed by the gili of Yom Echad. With the Fakum, they will be hit. Yoim, Agili, Echad, V'achtas Hashem, Umesim. In other words, if Adam Rishon had succeeded in bringing Mashiach, what would happen to us? Nothing would happen to us. We would never come into existence. We would be his fingers and toes, his hair and his nails. I mean it mystically, I don't mean it physically. We would not be Matthias of Neshama. He's an neshama. He's an essence, has free will. There's a possibility to create from him, you know what the Lashon is? 600,000 times 600,000 neshamas. 360 billion neshamas. That's how many sparks there are. Had other Merishim brought the world to fruition, those 360 billion neshamas would have been part of him. That's it. Every time there's a postponement of the Hisgalus of Achdus Hashem in the world, more neshamas are produced. Lower neshamas are produced. But once the neshama is produced and becomes a Matthias, the neshama is a Matthias. Transformation is going to happen. The little guys are going to be there too. In other words, it only works one way. Had other Medicians succeeded, the neshamas would never have come into Matthias. Once a neshama becomes a Matthias, every neshama is an etzem. Even though we're only little tiny pieces of his neshama, but when our neshama is made real, we become our own essence. We become our own essence, our own identity. And once that occurs, then it's forever. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, one of the advantages of the postponement of the Geula is that we'll be there. We would be there mimah nefshach. But had Geula happened sooner, we wouldn't be there as us. We'd be there as the hair and the nails of other Medish. Or Yankov Avinu. You follow?
Does that answer the question? Does that answer the question when people say which neshama, which will I come back as?
Well, the Rebbe says every neshama, every goof, that did as little as one mitzvah, even a boy who was gemalat at 8 days old or was given a Hebrew name, will have Tchias HaMesim, because once the neshama, so to speak, breaks off from its source, it becomes its own essence. Gilgul neshamas is connected to this idea. Gilgul neshamas means a higher neshama. Then the neshama comes back a second time. It's not the same neshama. It's a radiation. It's a ha'or of that original neshama. But it's a new Metzias at the same time, which is a little bit of the answer to the point you were trying to make. It's not a stira to say that a neshama is a gilgul from a different neshama and it's connected to this generation. Because once the neshama, so to speak, comes down, the arm is extended from the source, it becomes a Metzias unto itself. So it's a complicated situation in Gilgulim. But it's not just using the neshamas over. Although when you read some of the Rekante, you get the impression that it's just taking a battery, putting it back in a box, taking it back out, plugging it back in, and using it over again. Okay, so this is the idea of Gilgulim. You're giving a neshama a chance to come back a second time, but it's coming back in a different form, on a different level. It's a branch of the original neshama, and each time it returns, it's a branch of the neshama before, and it's a new Metzias at the same time. In other words, it's completely logical to say that a neshama has different wires. Mitzad echad, you're a gilgul of this neshama. Mitzad hasheni, you're a gilgul maybe of a different neshama. Mitzad hashlishi, you're connected to all the neshamas of your generation. You're connected to the nasi hu ha'kolah. These things are not contradictory necessarily. You follow? So let's take a look here. I printed a bunch of papers here. The first thing that he mentions is Hevel. Talking about Hevel. You see where I made the arrow on the left side of the page Mem Gimel. So the Ramban simply about the Ramban's Hagdama, did I not? What does the Ramban write in Hagdama to his Sefer? That I'm planning to write Seder of Pik Kabbalah, but don't even try to understand them because you're not going to understand them. But this is the Ramban. Look what the Ramban writes. He's talking about Hevel and the death of Hevel. Who was Hevel in the second Gilgul? Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was Gilgul of Hevel. And the side of Hevel is a Inyan Gobel. This guy Chevel, who compiled this Ramban, Latera quotes the drasha of the Ramban. The drasha of the Ramban and the Rikanti and the Tziyuni. And the Nekuda that they say is a very interesting thing. Sehr interessante Sache. What's the pshat that the Mishnah was in the Gilgul of Hevel? He said like this: Hevel brought a carbon, yeah, and the Eibusha sent down a fire and took the carbon. And Hevel looked at the fire, and he was not supposed to look at the fire. And this brought about Hevel's death. The untimely death of Hevel, of Kabbalah, was because he looked at the fire. Right? That's why when Moshe Rabbeinu saw the snare, he blocked his face. He didn't want to make the same mistake as Hevel. And the Rebbe sort of indicated to him, he's in a higher madreg. But it's just interesting to see that the Ramban talks about Gilgulim. What does he tell you? He tells you nothing. Turn the page and the same thing over again. This is already our Parsha. You see where I made the arrow? This is talking about the concept of Yibum, the relationship between between relatives, the idea of marrying the same women, and so on. So it says like this: Aval Indians say, God will say this Torah. The concept of Gilgulim is the great secret and the secrets of the Torah. Betuldas Adam, and the development and the birth of man. And he adds, V'nechadhu, it is foreign, le'einereim, to the eyes of those who see, Asher nasan lahem Hashem einayim lidas v'eznayim l'shmeya. I gave them eyes and ears, but the ruchnius, they're not sensitive to, and as a result, they cannot understand the secret. Okay? But the truth is that there's a great secret in Yibum. The great wise people who came before Torah knew the secret of Gilgulim. And that's why the concept of Yibum predates Matan Torah, right? The story of Oinan marrying Tamar happened before the Torah was given. The Chumash tells us a story about Yibum before the mitzvah of the Torah. The Hagel, the Kadmoinim knew the concept of Yibum. That a brother should marry the wife of his deceased brother is a big thing. He should come first. Whoever's closer, that he inherits the estate of the deceased brother, that Gil else will achieve for him a advantage. Okay? That the Ramban says that before Matan Torah, people knew this concept of a connection between brothers, between the shamas. And if another brother marries the wife of a deceased brother, they're giving that neshama of the deceased brother a chance to express itself in the children. But when it expresses itself in the children, it's going to be an anaf. It's going to be a branch of the original neshama, not the same neshama mamish. Anyway, that's a little Ramban. Now, let's read the Rabbeinu Bechaya. You just flip over the package, the Rabbeinu Bechaya. The Al Derech HaKabbalah. The Rabbeinu Bechaya has this question. What is the connection between the story of Yehuda and Tamar and the sale of Yosef? Right? Our Parsha begins with the brother selling Yosef, and then it says, Rashi says, why did Yosef go away from his brothers? Because Yehuda was the leader. He brought Yankovina so much anguish, they demoted him, so he left. He went away because he had caused his father so much sorrow. So the Rabbeinu Bechai says, what's the Kabbalistic connection between the Mechilas Yosef and the story of Yehuda and Tamar? Because it's the same meaning. The story of Mechilas Yosef was the precursor for the Asar Arugim Melucha, which is a concept of Gilgul. Yibum is also a concept of Gilgul, and this is why the Torah joins the two stories. He says, Smach Parshas Yibum the Parshas Amchira. The adjoining, the bringing close of this discussion of Yibum to the discussion of selling Yosef is Nismech Gilgul a Gilgul. He say that Yibum will say that Gilgul. The concept of Yibum is a concept of Gilgulim. It is known. Shechetahu, this sin of selling Yosef, like Hoya Efshel is battered Slavin, it couldn't be corrected and lightened. That the 10 people who were murdered by the kings of Rome was a correction of the murder of the Messiah of Yosef HaTzadik. Because at that time, the trap was broken, and the souls of the 10 Shvatim that were trapped were free to go back to their Father in heaven. The basic point is that the 10 brothers of Yosef are the 10 Arugim Malchus. And I tell you again, that's not the pshat that's mamish the same neshama. It's an anaf. You know, there's a shalosh someplace which talks about Gilgul. Ve'einon is Peretz and Zarach. Who Mashakos, the pasuk says, Vayamas ve'einon Beretz Canaan, Einon and David, Vayiyu b'nei Yehuda. And then it says that the sons of Yehuda were Peretz and Zarach. And the Rabbeinu Bechaya says, now, interesting, this is some of their detail. Why were there were 10 people murdered? There were only 9 brothers. I told you before, Yosef was also involved. The sin of his brothers was dependent upon him, was his fault. He was the cause for them wanting to sell him. He was pushing them around. He made them angry. And boasting with his dreams. Since he was part of the sin, he was part of the punishment. He was the 10th neshama. It was not about Yosef. Reuven was the 10th one. Yosef wasn't for the sale of Yosef. Reuven was not present when he was sold. Sorry? Okay, the sin of Bila was accounted for. Okay, now turn the page. Yeah. So now we're reading the Rabbeinu Bechaya inside. You see where I made the arrows? This is Parshas Vayigash, where the 70 names of Yaakov Avinu's Tzaddik are enumerated. So it says, Bnei Yehuda, Eir ve'einon ve'shelo Perez v'zorach, and then it says V'yomas Eir ve'einon Vayiyu Bnei Yehuda, whatever it is. Yachshav HaKosov Eir ve'einon shekvar meishu Michal Hashivim Aboyim. There's a tema, Kivon shemeishu kvar Eichas Kirem HaKosov Michal Aboyim, Aval Inyan Hu, Hasa Yidua B'Kabbalah, the content is in Kabbalah, Hu Mefurish Bo B'Zei Pinchas. She'amar Kosov Bnei Yehuda Eir ve'einon, V'yomas Eir ve'einon B'Eretz Kenan, V'samach Oz Miyad, Vayiyu Bnei Yehuda. And basically the point is, you don't count them twice. Ein and Einon are Peretz and Zarach. You understand? Bnei Yehuda Eir ve'einon, they died, and then they were reincarnated in Peretz and Zarach. But it's an arm, it's a branch, it's an eatus from the original Neshama. Ein and Einon were big people. If Peretz and Zarach were only a eatus of their Neshama, was an honor of their Shadish, they had to be. You never heard this chayim before. They were maximum 7 or 8 years old. Because between when Yosef was sold, they came to Mitzrayim was 22 years. They were conceived and born after Yosef was sold. When they came to Mitzrayim, Peretz and Zerach had children already. Peretz and Zerach had children. So in 22 years, Yehuda married Bathshua. She had 3 children. They grew up. That's a generation. They married Tamar. Right? They married Tamar. First one married Tamar, then he died. The second one married Tamar. He died. Then Yehuda married Tamar. Right? They had children, Chatzin and Chamo. They had to, Peretz and Zerach. They had to grow up and they had children, Chatzin and Chamo. All those 3 generations happened in 22 years. So any way you're going to spin it, they were for the mitzvah. And they were punished, Peretz and Zarach were enough of their shadish. That's the Kabbalistic form. They went grace in the Shabbos. And that's why the Eibishter got help in standard. Anyway, next. This is the Rabbeinu Bechaya in Parshas Shmois. You made the arrow, yeah? Sorry? Yeah, flip it over. V'derech HaKabbalah Moshe HaYarayah of the Rabbeinu Bechaya Kvar HaYarayah. You see it? He was already a shepherd. Kiloi Amar Vayihi Moshe Raya. It doesn't say Moshe became a shepherd. Moshe Amar Vayihi Hevel. Raya is saying Hevel was a shepherder of sheep. Oisha Yema Vayir, that's saying he shepherded the sheep. But rather that he already was a shepherd. Why? Because Moshe Rabbeinu was the Gilgul of the Neshama of Hevel. And that the Neshama has Gilgul only 3 times. Moshe Rabbeinu was in Gilgul 3 times. Hevel and Moshe and Eiv. Dachtach made that he has a kasha that he was here a 4th time, and he says something to the effect like Hevel didn't really live. But it says in Svarim that the Gilgul could only be 3 times. Hevel was the Shevish. And Moshe Rabbeinu was in Nitzitz. And then Eiv was Nitzitz. That's it. It says in Adizal that the Yidden were Mitzrayim with the Neshamas, Gilgul Neshamas and Deira Floga. Vice versa, before Matan Torah things were different. So Ingresser in Neshamas, Ingresser in Mensch, everything was on a different level. Look in the Ha'ara Lekach Hiskir, Kleimar, Shalayesh Ekfar Hoya, have already existed once before. You see what I'm reading?
In the small print.
No, the bottom of the page.
Bottom.
Lekach Hiskir, the last line on page.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, Kleimar, Shalayesh Ekfar Hoya. He already was. V'nenash, and Hevel was punished. Al Habatose, for looking at the fire. Ashabahura Nenash, Hevel was killed. It was punished, allowed to be killed. Ki kasher shah Hashem Yisbarach al Minchas, Hashem turned to his offering. A fire came out before the Rebbe, and he ate his mincha. Hitzitz v'nifta, he looked, and he was affected. This is why the beginning of Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy was also in a fire. L'sakein, to correct the mistake that Hevel made by looking at the fire. Now that's why it says Vayaster Beish Raponav. You see it? Mm-hmm. And the Rabbeinu Bechaya goes on to explain that what happened to Moshe Rabbeinu was that first he was only on a level of seeing Eish, and after he was Sneh. And then the Rabbeinu Bechaya describes how Moshe Rabbeinu grew in his avodah until he was able to speak to the Eish upon him. But in the beginning, all he was able to see was through Koyachal, through an Eish. And even this, Moshe Rabbeinu knew from his prior Gilgul, I'm Dafnish Kukken. Okay, this is the Rabbeinu Bechaya. Now you have a gewaldige rekanti. It goes on and on and on and on and on. This is Sefer Echolos. Kiven shadar Abduchoni ben Akana gezeh zu Ahmed varidani lemerkava ubikashti misad apnim va'amali and he said to me Asara kasfu bezdin shalmaylo v'natnu l'Samuel Sara shalei 10 were written down and given over to Samuel. Okay. Leimalach come to tell you v'hakechad me'abidei Yisrael, which means to destroy. Kol netach teiv yerech v'katev v'hashlim gzeire v'geinim ishu mechare v'nimitza d'meitzumas. You see that we're going to take the best. That's basically what it means. Take the best of Klal Yisrael and punish them is as a correction of a geinim ishu mechare. It's interesting when he describes netach teiv with a gutter shtickle. Yarech means a thigh, and katef means a shoulder. You could say that the diuk here is that they're an unaf, a branch, and not an etzem. Okay? V'shemeda leili hinaka mimenu, and he gave him instructions to take revenge. Achi yagia yifked l'shem al tzva morim b'morim shenishchat amutalhu. And he goes on to describe specifically who the Asarei Anugam Malchus were. 7 lines from the bottom of the second column, it says, 6 lines, V'shemes asara shvatim, shamachlu was Yosef, elim kishemes asara anudim maluchim. If you'll do the gematrias, you'll see that the gematrias of the 10 shvatim are identical with the gematrias of the names of the 10 individuals. In other words, you can figure out which corresponds to which. He says, Rak, although you're the cheshbon hazeh, the can't figure out this cheshbon, Rakim nichter, Chani ben Teradiyim b'shnei Yudin. The Asara Neskarim, Rab Shimon, Rab Yishmael, Rab Akiva, Chani ben Teradiyim with 2 Yuds, Rab Taifer, Yehuda ben Bavar, Yossi ben Shamuel, Yeshiva Sefer, Yehuda Hanachtem, Yehuda HaTurgaman, Sach Shmeisam, Gematria, Alpayim, Shmeina, Meza, Chamishim, Shmeina, their total is 2,885, and that's the same as the Shvatim. If you read Zevulim with 1 Vav, Levad Yezim V'Biyah. I can't say he brings all the different sources. Then if you'll turn 2 pages, Kuf Tezai, in other words, flip over 1 sheet, to page Kuf Yudalet, Vayema Yehuda La'ayman. You see? The first sugya of Gilgul was short. When he spoke about the son of Malchus, it's only 2 pages. It's not that much, right? Hagam never says he goes back to it later. But here he brings Gilgulim and Negei to the Inyan of Yibum. And he says like this. Let's read a little bit here. You have to contemplate this that I hinted to you before about the idea of Milah. And the Lavush writes, what is the idea of Milah? That when a Yid makes a Bris Milah, he becomes part of the Eibishter's Merkava. He becomes attached to the Eibishter. The Eibishter gave us this Rashum Bibsarenu B'Chesim Emes. It's carved in our flesh in the Chesim of Emes. Shusei Da Milah, which is the mystical secret of Milah. כפי מה שרמזנו למעלה. ובסייד זה נכנס אדם בסייד האמונה. And this allows the Jew to enter into the secret of Emunah. And the secret of Emunah, he translates, is that we could be part of the Eibish's Merkava, totally bottled Hashem. But every Jew is an expression of a lakus, and he doesn't want it to stop. You say, right? What's the difference between Kedusha and Klippa? The Kedusha is not ending, it continues. So you want the river not to dry up. There's no interruption in its flow from its source. If you, God forbid, choose not to have children and interrupt this source, it's as though you're weakening the kech, the maila, be'ein chevish, be'nor yechra v'yavish. It's a lashon pasuk. Since a person down here is a reflection of what's happening on high, any person whose source fails, interrupts, from having children, doesn't have a correction. And this is the basis for the idea of, he says, continuing. He says, continue, the neshama should continue, because from all Hemshech from the Eibush is Merkava. Okay, now, you have pages and pages and pages of this. I wish you a lot of luck. But I want you to know that the Rekanti is impossible to understand. The Levush, this commentary, really makes it possible to learn this properly. Now, let's go to the last page. So you're seeing Gilgulim appear really in the earliest sources in Torah. Obviously, Gilgulim is a concept of Kabbalah. But the first people really to write about it were the Ramban and the Rabbi B'chaye and the Rekanti and so on. And now we get to the Psad Yigon. Now, Rabbi said you need to understand a lot of stuff about the Psad Yigon. Obviously, the Psad Yigon was not a Mekubal, right? The Psad Yigon also believes in the concept of a Nefesh. He believes in the concept of a Neshama. And to him it was very, very important, the concept of the Nitzchias HaNefesh, the eternity of the soul. Even though a soul is a creation, it comes from the Eibishter. In other words, it once did not exist. Once it comes into existence, it exists forever. And the emissaries that Rambam writes a similar idea to. Why? Bodies die. Physical things die. A soul is a nivdal. A soul has no connection to physicality whatsoever. Once it comes into existence, it exists indefinitely. But it doesn't exist indefinitely physically. It exists only for a time physically, and then the body can no longer keep itself refreshed and renewed. The body dies, and the neshama lives on. Right? Correct? So we had a concept of a neshama. But his concept of a neshama was almost every week we talk about this difference between Kabbalah and not Kabbalah. What is the Chiddush of Kabbalah? The Chiddush of Kabbalah is one of the most basic Chiddush of Kabbalah, is a concept called Elokus. Elokus means godliness. Getlechkeit, right? There's God, there's creation, there's godliness. In the world of the Psad God, there was no such thing. Either Boire or Niva, creator or creation. The concept of the light of Hashem is foreign to him. It's unacceptable to him. The Maram Prague was a very, very big Mekubal. The Maram Prague's problem was Achilas, but not the Lakus.
It's better than also?
No. That it can't be a Lakus of the Tzir, but it is a Musag of a Lakus. Oide itself, yeah. The problem with Caleb. The Chaykim have no concept not of Caleb, not of Eid itself.
Yeah, last year also you brought a vision about the Tias.
Yeah, the Tias and Nivdalim. Yeah, Nivdalim is creation. The Tias are Svedis. What's godliness? An expression of the Eibishter. Torah is the Eibishter's light. Neshamas Yisrael are also godly. Neshamas Yisrael are also getlachet, they're also godly. But there's a fundamental difference between how Torah is godliness and how Neshamas Yisrael are godliness. Because the godliness of a Neshama is a very, very weird idea. The godliness of a Neshama is a very funny concept. The language, the wording for describing how a Neshama is godly is, quote, Elakus Shenasa Nir. Elikus Shinas Nir means how godliness becomes a thing. Torah Eid. Torah doesn't become a thing. Torah is a reflection of the Eibishter. Everything else is never. They're creations. They're limited. Time, space, reality. A neshama is the ultimate paradox. It's godliness and a thing. It's godliness and it's Matthias. If you're all Matthias, how could you be godly? And if you're God, how could you be your own Matthias? Good question. And the answer to the question is because it's the etzem of Alakus and neshama. Torah Oid. Torah is a light of the Eibishter. The light of the Eibishter has to be connected to its source. It doesn't have its own etzem. And the neshama is Alakus Shenas and how godliness becomes a thing, but it has the etzem of Alakus. That's why it can be godly and a thing. When the neshama produces a nitzutz, right? A higher neshama produces a lower neshama. What happens? At first, it's a light of the higher neshama, and then it becomes a Matthias. It has its own etzem, its own Matthias, which is really the secret of Gilgul Neshamas. The secret of Gilgul Neshamas is a branch of your root is a root on its own. A light of your soul has its own etzem, right? In other words, if you come back in a second Gilgul, it's not the pshat. You've stretched out your hand and you put it into a goof and you're giving it life. A piece of you has now become, though it's a piece of you, a completely new Matthias, and that's the Gilgul, which is Mesabish in the new goof. This atzmius of neshama is foreign to the Rasag. The emes is moved from Matthias completely. In other words, because the Rasag was a chayker, his vision of what a neshama is void of a goof is actually more spiritual than the Kabbalistic. Kabbalah creates these very, very unique concepts. It's Getlach and a Matthias. Rasag has a problem with Getlach. But he doesn't believe anything. There's God, there's Eibishter, and then there's creation. That's all. But the idea that a neshama could be godly in a thing is foreign to him also. To him, a neshama is a light. To him, a neshama is a light. It doesn't take on its own action. So Gilgul Neshamas would be the same light again. If you have a concept of Gilgul Neshamas based on Kabbalah, which has this notion of how every neshama, it's a piece of the Eibishter, but it's a thing. And a smaller neshama is a piece of a larger neshama, and it's its own thing. It's a different concept. As opposed to just a very spiritual light, so to speak, being recycled, being reused. There's a huge, huge problem with that. You follow what I'm trying to say? But the emes is this, the Psad Yegon, that you can help us with Gilgulim. But if you'll read what the Psad Yegon says about Gilgulim, you'll come to a very simple conclusion. The Gilgulim he's talking about, nobody holds on. So let's read, you know what I'm trying to say? My fantasy, my dream, is to show how what the Psad Yegon is saying is not a state of Kabbalah at all. All those people tell you Psad Yegon didn't hold from Gilgulim, it's true. But what type of Gilgulim? The type of Gilgulim you hear about from the Hindus, the Buddhists. Not the type of Gilgulim which written in Kabbalah. So let's read a little bit. I want to tell you. People who are called Jews. No, I made the arrows. Men who are called Jews. Look at the language. They believe in the concept of reincarnation. The Kedem makes them hair tuckers. And they call it, ready? Psychiatrist?
Yeah.
Transference. Okay. Hair tuckers, that means transference. To transpose. And what they believe, the idea that they believe is, Ruach Ruven Tia B'Shimon. The spirit of Ruven will be in Shimon. But you see, what he's saying, the concept of Gilgul that he's describing is very, very simplistic. It's the transportation of a neshama from one goof to another. Umehem Ayrubam, they, or at least the majority of them, say and believe that the neshamas can be transferred from man to animal, from animal to man, udvarim, rabim, min hazoyes, halol, all these mishigasin and these confusions.
Well, they could.
Huh?
They could.
They cannot. The Beferish cannot. One of the inyanim which is discussed in Hasidus, with a greise shturim. One of the inyanim, which is in Hasidus, the shturim is like this. You have Mamali Kalam, you have Sevim Kalam, you have Atma Zedin right? What's the difference between Mamali Kalam and Sevim Kalam and Atma Zedin Mamali Kalam is primi. It's personal. Sevim Kalam is makif. Atma Zedin is a makif lim makif. All the Mari Hasidus, they talk to you about Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechida, and then they add, but Yechida is also a Pnimi. For example, one Neshama can't be in two gufas, and the Neshama of a person cannot be in the guf of an animal. Take a look at Tafshin Ches and Samach Gimel. So what's the pshat? What's the pshat? The etzem ha-neshama of a yid, of a person, is catered for a guf of a yid, of a person. You take a Neshama, put it in the guf of a behemoth, it's a chad.
Right, no.
The neshama goes into it, but it's not able to express itself. The description that the Tzaddik Gaon is describing is what the Hindus describe. You become an animal. In a different life you were an animal. In a different life you were a cherry. In a different life you were a rock. In a different life you were a cloud. And now you're Bob. The neshama is drained. You understand? And you be this, you be this, be this. It's a very marketing concept of the neshama. It's not the same concept at all. It's very simplistic. The nisbareli, and it became clear to me, Mashamedamim, what they were thinking, Shehu Havim Alidav, in other words, what was the root and the source of their position. And after I figured out the root and the source of their position, Umatsasim Arba Toyes, I identified 4 areas of mistake, but and here I intend to deal with them. Tzaddik Gaon has this idea, where when he has an issue, he'll lay it on thick, he'll bring you like 15 terutzim to a kasha. This is typical of Tzaddik Gaon. Here's the kasha, and there are so many terutzim. And he's saying, 4 of the terutzim, the ones I gave you on that kasha, they apply here too. The 3rd kasha, I gave you 2 more terutzim, they apply. That's how Zakapon. I'll tell you what the Nakud that the Tzaddik Gaon is envisioning. And in other words, what was the concept of Gilgul he was relating to, and what his objection was. The Eastern religions believe in Gilgul, reincarnation. The body is temporary, the soul is permanent. With a very, very important nekudah. And that is that the soul, like the body, is a part of the physical universe. The soul, like the body, the neshama and the guf are part of the physical universe. When the neshama departs from the guf, where does it go? No place. So it comes back into a different guf. When it departs from that body, where does it go? No place. That's not Jewish. There's nothing Jewish about that. The Jewish concept of Gilgul is a neshama was in this world, right? I'm talking about Gilgul neshamas in a group of a person. I'm not talking about Gilgul neshamas, which is a oynish. The neshama has chibut hakeva, then it has kafar kela, then the Gemara says mutar to a dainu leis damadasa, and it goes to Gan Eden, and even by the Shoym it's not going to be an Av Chedesh, right? Or whatever, it's your base Chedesh. And then it goes to Gan Eden, and it goes higher and higher and higher in Gan Eden. And then there's the concept of Gilgul neshamas. Between one Gilgul and the next Gilgul, there's no relationship. It's not like you inherit traits from a previous Gilgul. Your previous life had to do with your current life, psychologically. Mystically, Kabbalistically, there's a connection between your previous life and this life. But it's only a mystical connection. It's a Kabbalistic connection. It's not like you could have... I remember what I was in the previous Gilgul. Because between the old Gilgul and the old Gilgul, you go away from the Gashmiistic world completely. Mm-hmm. And like it tells in the Heilig Svarim, you have to forget Chizah Hayalma. And when the Gilgul comes back, it's a new Matthias. It's Taka Gilgul, but it's a new Matthias. As I explained to you earlier, that every neshama is an etzem. And when the neshama has an anaf, a branch, a nitzah to that neshama, which comes back a second time, mitzad echad, it's a continuation of the earlier neshama, mitzad Hashem is a new Matthias. The concept of Gilgul, which Tzaddik Gaon is objecting to, is a goyish concept. It's a Avodah Zarah concept. Okay. But Gilgul Zeh B'Gilgul Achad doesn't mean that the previous Gilgul and this Gilgul are one hemshech. They are and they aren't.
Yeah, but you bring miracle to something today. In this Gilgul, something that Yana Neshama and Yana Guf, what Ketan Adar and Aveda Adar Adas.
That is good for Shane. So at least let's read the first two. He's a Reishis Kol. The first thing, says the Tzaddik Gaon, is the people who believe in this concept of Gilgul believed in the concept of Ruchnius or Shol Shitas Acheres. I'm going to save you details. I'm going to save you all the long form. I'll tell you the Nekuda. It's mamish what Alter Rebbe says in Tanya. The word Ruchnius is the Tzaddik Gaon's word for the atom, for the Greek atom. What is the significance of this word? The significance of this word in simple words is that the people who were Mamine Haruchnius believed in Yesh Mayash and not in Yesh Mayayin. The original material of the universe always was. The Choyim and Harishan always was. It's just recycled and it's changed over, but there's no Yesh Mayayin. So what's Yesh Mamine Haruchnius? You believe that Gashmius is a Kadman. It always existed. If you believe that Gashmius is a Kadman, you believe that the neshama, even when it departs from a particular guf, still has a connection to Gashmias. So when it's going to come back a second time in a different guf, there's no ayin between yesh and yesh. It's continuation of yesh. You understand? But it's how you go in the chashtus. Why? Because the truth is that it's yesh me'ayin. First there was no world, now there is a world. If you believe in the kadmus of the Chaim Radishan, what the Rabbi Tzaddik calls Ruchnius. So if a living thing existed, and then what died? The guf dies. But the guf doesn't die completely. The Chaim Radishan always existed, will always exist. The neshama also is recycled, all within the same space. It's all within the same yeshus of Elam Hazah. There's no such thing as the yesh becoming ayin, and when it becomes a yesh again, it's a new material. It's a continuation from the old. After that, when he talks about the Apikosim, he says that they made the mistake of comparing creation to Ma'aseh Enesh Tachbalaisa. Yesh miyesh, Yakshemashana Atzura. Why? Because they believe the Chaim Rishon is a Kadmon. So that's Tzaddik Gaon. What he's really saying is, the reason they believed in reincarnation is because they believed that the physical universe is the be-all and all that exists. And that the physical universe always existed. Maybe there's a God. But the God is not creating the world. He's simply forming it. The material of creation, they didn't believe in Yesh Mayayin. They didn't believe the Eibush has the power to make nothing into something. Or a non-thing into a thing. The link between that and Gilgul tells you everything you need to know about what Tzaddik Gaon is thinking. Tzaddik Gaon is thinking, they believe that the whole reality is the physical universe. And when the neshama leaves the guf, it remains in the physical universe. And it's being recycled. In other words, it's not like the neshama goes away and comes back. It's a continuation of the same neshama. Look at Tzaddik Gaon, shtus. And you know what? Nobody has a problem with that. What the Tzaddik Gaon is objecting to is not the Teda concept of Gilgul. It's the Buddhist concept of Gilgul. You understand what I'm saying? V'asheni, Nochanekudah, 3 lines in the bottom. Hitchakusam acharei midas rab min, their analysis, their recognition about many midas of people that are motzam daimim lamidas habehemoth, similar to the midas of animals. But meshesh adin kitchunas hakvasim, there are fine people like the character of sheep. V'takiv kitchunas haterfim, and tough like the character of the predators. V'rav v'shafo kitchunas hakelev, evil and low, the character of a dog. Ted doesn't really like dogs at all, huh? The cow and light as the character of birds. And when you see different people with personalities that are animal-like traits, and they came to the maskana, the fact that people have certain tivim like this, say it. It enhances you of in other words, not only they believe in Gilgulim, they believe that the difference between the nefesh of a person, nefesh and an animal, is Pashat Guf. Take a person, put it to the bottom of an animal, becomes the soul of an animal. Take the soul of an animal, put it to a person. It's Pashat, it's recycling. So, and he goes on for 4 pages, and at the end, right, at the very end, he says, I shouldn't even waste my time talking about it. If you look on page Reish Yud Zayin, you see Reish Yud Zayin. V'hayisi, it's the last word on the line. I have a comment there, you see. V'hayisi chasal devari v'haskeshitos. I really wouldn't mention it. They deserve to be not mentioned. They are fools, and my job is to deal with fools, and therefore I have to mention it. So, my real interest in this class is to find out from the Tzaddik God. Gilgul in Torah is not what people think it is. Number one, it's not the same neshama that's coming back a second time. It's an anaf of the Shadish. It's a branch of the original. Number two, between one Gilgul and the next, there's an ayin and a yesh. An ayin and a new yesh. And the gather of the neshama is, as many times the neshama comes into the world, that's how many atzmiyus that neshama becomes. Each one is kind of connected to the Shadish, but each one is an inyan atzmi. And therefore, it's not like you have these souls swimming around. They see a body, they go into it. They live 70 or 80 years. The body dies. The soul takes off, flaps its wings, goes up into the heavens, takes out its binoculars or unicular, and sees that the baby's going to be born. Oh, I ended up in a cockroach. Okay, you felt like I won't last for too long. And as though it's almost a continuation of the same consciousness. This is a Tzaddik Gaon's objection. Because the neshamas get lachkaita.